The winter of 1887 had settled across the Blue Ridge Mountains with particular ferocity. In Henderson County, North Carolina, most residents had retreated to their homes, conserving energy and supplies until the thaw. But from the higher elevations, smoke still rose from one isolated cabin perched precariously on what locals called Widow's Ridge, though the woman who lived there had never married. Eleanor Maynard's homestead stood unlike any other in the county. While most cabins featured standard construction, a single hearth, thin walls, and minimal insulation, Maynard's structure appeared almost fortress-like by comparison. Double-walled throughout, with an ingenious system of air gaps filled with dried moss, the cabin retained heat with remarkable efficiency. The hearth itself was a masterwork of stone and clay, built larger than common practice dictated, with a chimney stack that widened rather than narrowed as it rose, a curious design that drew comments from the few travelers who passed through. "A waste of good stone," remarked Joseph Dunlap, a sawmill operator who had supplied lumber to Maynard years earlier. His sentiment was echoed by many in the closest settlement of Hendersonville. "Woman's built herself a mansion for no reason but pride," others would say, when discussing the peculiar cabin that stood apart from the mountain community. County records show that Eleanor Maynard purchased her 80 acres in 1879 for a sum that raised eyebrows among local administrators. The land was considered poor for farming, too rocky, too steep, with unreliable water access during dry seasons. Yet she insisted on the parcel, paying in full with silver dollars wrapped in canvas bags. The deed, preserved in the Henderson County Archives, bears Maynard's unusually precise signature, alongside a curious addendum in her handwriting noting the elevation, prevailing wind direction, and natural springs that intersected the property. What brought a woman alone to establish herself in such remote terrain remains debated among local historians. Some accounts suggest she had worked as a nurse during the Civil War, while others indicate she may have been employed by wealthy families in Charleston before making her way to the mountains. The 1880 census lists her occupation simply as landowner, one of few women designated as such in the entire state records. The ridge where Maynard built her home stood exposed to northwestern winds that swept down from Tennessee, bringing the harshest weather patterns in the region. This geographical reality made her choice of location all the more puzzling to neighbors. "Good land lies in valleys, not on ridges," was common wisdom among settlers who had learned through generations which spots offered the most protection from mountain elements. Yet Eleanor Maynard seemed to deliberately choose the path of most resistance, establishing herself where winter struck hardest and summer sun beat down most relentlessly. The peculiarity of her decisions did not end with location. According to ledgers from McCormick's General Store in Hendersonville, Maynard's purchasing patterns differed dramatically from other homesteaders. Where most residents bought supplies weekly or biweekly, her name appears in clusters, massive purchases made quarterly, often depleting the store's reserves of certain goods. "Miss Maynard cleared us out of lamp oil last fall," reads a notation from September 1885. 12 gallons purchased. Had to reorder from Asheville. Similar entries document unusual quantities of salt, coffee beans, medicines, and tools. The pattern suggested someone preparing not just for seasonal changes, but for potential isolation spanning months. The locals' assessment of Maynard oscillated between grudging respect and outright mockery. At community gatherings in Hendersonville, her absence was noted, but rarely mourned. "Mountain Witch," some called her, though not for any perceived mystical activities, but rather her seeming rejection of social convention. Others used "the Professor," a sardonic reference to her evident planning and methodical approach to mountain living. What few in the community recognized was that Eleanor Maynard's preparations were not born of eccentricity, but of careful study. Among her possessions, later catalogued by the Henderson County Historical Society in 1962, was a leather-bound journal containing handwritten copies of weather patterns dating back 50 years. The journal included newspaper clippings from severe winters throughout the Appalachians, with notations on building techniques from regions as distant as Alaska and Scandinavia. This level of foresight would prove more valuable than anyone could have anticipated as the autumn of 1887 turned to winter. Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The first signs of the approaching crisis appeared in late September of 1887. Farmers in the lowlands reported acorns dropping nearly 3 weeks earlier than usual. Foxes were spotted with winter coats fully developed before the first frost. Woolly bear caterpillars, whose banding supposedly foretold winter's severity, displayed an unusual predominance of black, a folk indication of harsh weather to come. These natural warning signs were noted, but largely dismissed in Hendersonville. The previous 3 winters had been mild by mountain standards, leading to a collective complacency. When Eleanor Maynard arrived at McCormick's store on October 3rd, her list of supplies was so extensive that proprietor William McCormick initially thought she was purchasing for multiple families. "This for a church collection, Miss Maynard?" he inquired, according to his business journal. "For survival," was her terse reply. The exchange was witnessed by several townspeople, including Reverend Thomas Holloway of the First Baptist Church, who later recalled Maynard's unusual request for the store's entire stock of medical supplies: quinine, witch hazel, bandages, and tincture of iodine. When McCormick suggested she might be overreacting to squirrel behavior and folklore, witnesses report that Maynard unfolded a chart of barometric readings she had been tracking since August. "Pressure's dropping earlier and faster than any year in my records," she told him. "You'd do well to order triple your usual supplies before the first snow." McCormick documented her warning in his journal with a skeptical note. Miss M., predicting biblical winter, increased order by 15% as compromise. Cannot justify more based on amateur forecasting. The store proprietor's decision reflected the community's broader attitude toward preparation, a tendency to prepare for the expected rather than the possible. Inventory records from McCormick's establishment show typical winter stocking patterns based on consumption from previous years, with minimal allowance for deviation. This approach, standard for rural merchants of the era, assumed historical patterns would continue uninterrupted. By the first week of November, light snow had dusted the higher elevations, nothing unusual for the season. Eleanor Maynard was observed making final preparations to her property. Samuel Jenkins, a hunter who occasionally traversed her land with permission, reported seeing her installing wooden shutters on all windows, shutters with an unusual design that included a layer of oiled canvas between planks. Jenkins's account, recorded in his hunting journal and later donated to the County Historical Society, describes these shutters in remarkable detail. Miss Maynard's window coverings unlike any I've seen. Outer planks of seasoned oak, inner layer of pine, with oiled canvas sandwiched between, edges sealed with leather stripping. When closed and latched, no draft whatsoever detectable. Told me they'd keep out cold, better than brick. Seemed excessive for November weather. Jenkins also noted extensive wood piles strategically placed around the property. Not one central stack, as was common practice, but 5 separate cords positioned near different access points to the cabin. When he commented on the excessive amount, Maynard reportedly replied, "A person can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, but in these mountains, 3 hours without heat in the dead of winter can be just as fatal." This statement, later referenced frequently in county educational materials, encapsulated Maynard's philosophy of preparation, a hierarchical understanding of survival needs specific to the mountain environment. Her approach prioritized thermal management as equal to traditional survival necessities, a perspective that differed from conventional wisdom of the time. The peculiarity of Maynard's preparations extended to water management. County surveyor records from 1885 show that she had commissioned the mapping of 3 springs on her property, and subsequent examination revealed she had hand-dug channels to redirect 2 of these water sources closer to her cabin. She had also constructed an elaborate catchment system from the roof gutters to a series of connected barrels in a dugout cellar, a system that could store approximately 380 gallons of water. These precautions seemed excessive to visitors. Henderson County at the time averaged 67 inches of precipitation annually, with reliable water sources throughout the region. The idea of running out of water seemed preposterous to most locals. Yet Maynard maintained her systems with rigorous attention, clearing channels monthly and testing springs weekly, according to her personal almanac. The almanac itself, preserved in fragmented form in the Henderson County Historical Society collection, reveals her systematic approach to property management. Each page dedicated to water systems includes not only maintenance schedules, but water quality assessments, notations on clarity, taste, and flow rates that suggest an understanding of hydrology beyond common practice of the period. The first substantial snowfall arrived on November 28, 1887, dropping 8 inches across the county. It was followed by another system on December 4th that added an additional 6 inches. Neither storm was unprecedented, and the community's response was routine. Schools closed temporarily, some roads became impassable for wagons, but foot traffic continued, and commerce in Hendersonville proceeded with minor inconvenience. What no one anticipated was the temperature drop that arrived on December 10th. Thermometers throughout the region recorded a plunge from 30 degrees Fahrenheit to 5 degrees within hours. The rapid freezing created ice sheets over the existing snow, making travel treacherous even on foot. By December 12th, the temperature had fallen to minus 10 degrees, the coldest reading in county records to that date. The Henderson County Gazette of December 15th reported, "Unprecedented cold grips our community. Coal and wood suppliers overwhelmed with demand." Dr. Hargrove reports 3 cases of severe frostbite from mere minutes of exposure. Citizens advised to remain indoors, except for essential activities. This initial cold snap might have been manageable as an isolated event, but weather journals from the period indicate it was merely the beginning. Between December 12th and December 30th, 3 additional snowstorms struck the region, each dropping between 10 and 14 inches of snow. With temperatures remaining well below freezing, there was no melting between systems. By the new year, accumulated snow depth in Henderson County averaged 38 inches, with drifts reported up to 6 feet. The town of Hendersonville found itself effectively isolated. The railway line to Asheville became impassable after a small trestle collapsed under snow weight on December 27th. Telegraph lines failed on January 2nd when ice-laden poles snapped. Roads to neighboring counties were completely blocked by both snow accumulation and fallen trees, their branches shattered by the weight of ice. Sheriff Patterson's logbook entries from this period document the escalating crisis. January 3, 1888. All routes to Asheville blocked. Attempted passage with 6-horse team unsuccessful. Telegraph service remains down. Community effectively isolated until conditions improve. Concerns growing regarding supplies and medical access. What had seemed like overcaution now appeared prescient. McCormick's store, which had increased stock by only 15% on Maynard's suggestion, found its shelves emptying rapidly. By January 5th, the establishment had implemented strict rationing, 1 pound of coffee per family per month, limited flour and sugar, and no tobacco or alcohol available at any price. McCormick's ledger from this period shows increasingly desperate notations. Cannot restock. No word from Asheville suppliers. Must further reduce rations. The rationing system, initially organized as equal distribution, soon faced challenges. McCormick's private journal reveals the ethical dilemmas he confronted, difficult decisions daily regarding allocation. Families with ill members require additional support, yet supplies dwindle, community beginning to fragment under pressure. Some suggest preferential treatment for contributing members, while others argue for need-based distribution, finding middle path increasingly difficult. The community turned to hunting for supplemental food, but even this proved difficult. Game had either migrated or burrowed deep, and hunters returned empty-handed or with meager results despite dangerous hours in the extreme cold. Reverend Holloway's diary entries from mid-January describe growing tension in the town. Tempers flaring at McCormick's today. Jenkins accused Dunlap of taking more than his share of cornmeal. Nearly came to blows before Sheriff Patterson intervened. The Baptist church records indicate increasing attendance at daily prayer services, not merely for spiritual comfort, but for physical warmth, as the church building was maintained at higher temperatures than most homes could manage with dwindling fuel supplies. The church account books showed dramatically increased firewood consumption, with notations regarding communal warming periods following services. As conditions deteriorated, thoughts turned to the remote homesteads scattered through the mountains. A committee was formed to check on isolated residents, but deep snow and treacherous conditions meant they could reach only the closest properties. Those on higher elevations, including Eleanor Maynard, remained inaccessible. "Cannot justify risk to reach Widow's Ridge," wrote Sheriff Patterson in the county logbook on January 18th. "Must assume Maynard perished or surviving on preparations. No rescue possible until thaw." The sheriff's pragmatic assessment reflected the harsh realities of frontier crisis management, the need to allocate limited resources where they might prove most effective, even when such decisions meant abandoning those in remote locations. This triage approach, though necessary, weighed heavily on community leaders, as evidenced by Patterson's subsequent journal entries expressing concern for those beyond reach. The assumption of her death seemed reasonable, given the circumstances. Even well-supplied families in town were struggling by late January. The Baptist church had been converted to a communal sleeping area to conserve firewood, with families taking turns tending a central hearth. Food supplies continued to dwindle. Medical issues, frostbite, respiratory infections, and injury from accidents on ice strained the town's two doctors. Dr. William Hargrove, the senior physician, documented the deteriorating health conditions in his medical journal, cases of severe frostbite increasing daily. 4 amputations performed this week alone, supplies of ether and chloroform dangerously low. Most concerning is the spread of pneumonia. 17 cases identified, primarily among the elderly. Medications nearly exhausted, resorting to steam treatments and mustard poultices. The doctor's records from this period reveal not only the medical challenges but the psychological impact of prolonged isolation and hardship. He noted increasing cases of what he termed winter melancholy, symptoms consistent with what modern medicine would identify as seasonal depression, exacerbated by physical privation and social stress. His treatment options, limited by available supplies, focused primarily on maintaining community connections through organized activities at the church. The winter maintained its grip through February, with temperatures rarely rising above 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Additional snowfall on February 8th and 22nd added to the already substantial accumulation. By month's end, Henderson County had experienced what meteorological histories would later call the most severe winter in recorded history for the region. County Clerk Thomas Richardson, whose position required him to maintain official records of deaths, noted in his personal diary the increasing difficulty of proper burial procedures, ground frozen beyond PICS penetration, temporary storage of deceased in McFarland's ice house until spring thaw permits proper interment, 17 bodies currently awaiting burial, Reverend Holloway conducting abbreviated services, community morale declining with each death. The ice house, originally constructed for commercial food preservation, had been repurposed as a temporary morgue. a practical but psychologically disturbing solution that weighed heavily on the community. Richardson's diary describes the emotional impact. Each addition to McFarland's building reinforces our collective failure to prepare adequately. Cannot help but wonder if more could have been done before winter's arrival. The first signs of thaw didn't appear until March 12th, when temperatures rose above freezing for several hours midday. Progress remained slow. The heavy snow melted incrementally, causing localized flooding and making roads muddy but passable. Telegraph communication with Asheville was restored on March 18th, and the first supply wagons arrived on March 23rd, bringing desperately needed provisions. The Asheville Citizen newspaper of March 24, 1888, carried the first external report of Henderson County's ordeal. Hendersonville emerges from winter's prison. Reliable sources report substantial casualties from cold and privation. Initial estimates suggest between 15 and 20 souls lost to the elements, with final accounting still underway as remote homesteads are reached. The arrival of supplies brought immediate relief, but also highlighted the inequities that had developed during isolation. Sheriff Patterson's records document disputes over distribution priorities, whether to allocate based on previous rationing systems or to prioritize those in most dire need. The compromise system eventually implemented included medical assessment of individual conditions alongside consideration of previous cooperation with community conservation efforts. As conditions improved, attention returned to the outlying homesteads. Recovery teams found a grim tableau of 17 isolated cabins visited by April 1st. 11 contained deceased occupants, primarily from combinations of hypothermia and starvation. The community braced for similar news from Widow's Ridge as a team finally managed to cut through fallen trees and navigate the still treacherous path to Eleanor Maynard's property. What they discovered defied expectations. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney of Maynard's cabin. The approaching party reported the path to her door had been recently cleared, with snow piled in organized banks rather than the haphazard drifts found elsewhere. Most surprising was the sound that greeted them before they reached the cabin, the rhythmic striking of metal on metal, the unmistakable cadence of blacksmithing. Sheriff Patterson's official account, preserved in county records, describes their astonishment upon reaching the clearing. Found Miss Maynard engaged in repair of metal bucket near outdoor forge. Subject appeared in good health, adequate weight, no visible signs of frostbite or distress. Expressed no surprise at our arrival. This clinical description was expanded in Patterson's personal journal, where he wrote, "Never witnessed such a shocking contrast between expectation and reality. Where we anticipated finding another frozen corpse, we instead discovered a woman seemingly untouched by the catastrophe that had engulfed the county." The cognitive discord of the moment is difficult to articulate, as though we had traveled to another world where winter had been merely an inconvenience rather than a killer. According to multiple witness statements, Maynard invited the party inside for coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute that had become standard in Hendersonville. The interior of the cabin was warm, maintained at what the sheriff estimated to be nearly 65 degrees, despite outdoor temperatures still hovering around 40. Food was evident in appropriate quantities: smoked meat hanging from rafters, preserved vegetables in glass jars, and a pot of stew simmering on the hearth. Deputy James Collins, who accompanied Patterson, later described the sensory impact of entering Maynard's cabin. The warmth hit us like a physical force after months of persistent cold. The smell of coffee and cooking food seemed almost overwhelming after weeks of monotonous rations. Most striking was Miss Maynard herself, clean, composed, seemingly unaffected by the isolation that had driven others to desperation or death. She welcomed us as though we were expected guests rather than potential rescuers. When questioned about her survival, Maynard's responses were matter-of-fact. "I prepared," she told them. The double-walled construction had maintained insulation even during the worst cold. Her wood supplies, initially mocked as excessive, had proven precisely adequate. She reported having approximately one cord remaining, enough for another month if needed. The strategic placement of wood piles had been intentional, allowing her to retrieve fuel without trudging through deep snow from a single location. When snow accumulated too heavily on the roof, threatening structural integrity, she had cleared it systematically using a specialized rake fashioned with an extended handle, accessing different sections through the attic dormers. Her water management systems had functioned as designed. When springs froze, she had harvested snow, melting it in large copper pots on the hearth. The catchment barrels in the cellar had remained liquid due to their below-ground placement and provided washing water throughout the winter. Perhaps most impressive was her food storage strategy. Unlike the town's centralized approach through McCormick's store, Maynard had diversified and designed for extreme duration. Dried beans, corn, and wheat were stored in sealed pottery containers. Smoked venison and pork hung from rafters. Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips were packed in sand in the cellar. Her ledger showed precise inventory counts with projected consumption rates that would have sustained her until May if necessary. The precision of her record-keeping extended to all aspects of resource management. The ledger, later examined by county officials, included daily tracking of food consumption, fuel usage, and water availability. Each entry incorporated projections based on remaining supplies, creating a continuously updated assessment of sustainability. This systematic approach allowed for adaptive management, adjusting usage rates based on changing conditions and extending viability well beyond what would have been possible with less rigorous monitoring. Sheriff Patterson's report concludes with a remarkable observation. Miss Maynard reports no hardship during winter period. Subject maintained normal activities, including reading, handicrafts, and equipment maintenance. Expressed concern for town residents, but no surprise at reported casualties. This final statement, that Maynard expressed concern but not surprise regarding the deaths in Hendersonville, would later become a point of contention in community discussions. Some interpreted it as callousness, while others recognized it as the pragmatic assessment of someone who had anticipated the consequences of inadequate preparation. The revelation of Maynard's successful survival spread quickly through Hendersonville. Initial reactions mixed disbelief with resentment. How had one woman alone managed what entire families could not? The prevailing sentiment was captured in Reverend Holloway's journal. Some speak as if Maynard's preparation was somehow unfair, as if her foresight constituted an offensive against those who suffered, strange logic that transforms prudence into pride. This psychological response, resentment toward those whose preparation spared them from shared suffering, manifested in complex ways throughout the community. McCormick's Journal records customers' comments regarding Maynard's supplies, whispers suggesting she hoarded beyond need, though facts contradict this narrative. Easier to blame exceptional preparation than acknowledge insufficient foresight. When asked directly why she had prepared so extensively, Maynard's response was documented by multiple sources. Because history repeats, and nature gives warnings to those willing to observe. She then produced her weather journal, showing similar barometric patterns preceding severe winters in 1852 and 1867, along with newspaper accounts of the resulting hardships. The journal itself represented an extraordinary document. Each page contained meticulous recordings of temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction, and precipitation, with annotations regarding natural indicators, animal behaviors, plant conditions, and celestial observations. Most striking were the correlations she had identified between specific combinations of these factors and subsequent weather patterns. Dr. Hargrove, who examined the journal during a subsequent visit to Maynard's property, noted in his medical records that her predictive methodology incorporated multiple verification systems, cross-referencing natural signs with instrumental readings and historical patterns. Miss Maynard's approach represents an intriguing blend of folk wisdom and scientific method, he wrote. Her results suggest a predictive accuracy exceeding our current meteorological understanding. The validation of her methods came not just from her personal survival, but from the demonstrable accuracy of her forecasting. When compared to official weather records from the period, Maynard's predictions showed remarkable correlation with actual conditions, not merely in general trends, but in specific timing and severity. This empirical validation gradually shifted community perception from skepticism to recognition of genuine expertise. The 1887-1888 winter ultimately claimed 23 lives in Henderson County, a devastating toll for a community of that size. As spring fully arrived and recovery began, attitudes toward Maynard gradually shifted. Initial resentment gave way to curiosity. By summer, her homestead had become an unofficial destination for visitors seeking advice on construction techniques and storage systems. The transition from ridicule to recognition happened gradually, documented through various community records. Church minutes from May 1888 note a proposal to invite Maynard to speak on winter preparation from a Christian perspective, though there is no evidence she accepted this invitation. McCormick's business ledgers show increasing purchases of materials consistent with her insulation methods, particularly moss, canvas, and specific types of clay used in her chimney design. County records indicate that building practices changed significantly in the following years. Applications for construction permits show a marked increase in specifications for double-wall insulation, improved chimney designs, and expanded cellar storage. The general store's ordering patterns, documented in McCormick's ledgers, demonstrate higher autumn stock levels and more diverse emergency supplies. These changes represented not merely practical adaptations, but a philosophical shift in the community's relationship with environmental risk. Where preparation had once been based primarily on historical averages, the new approach incorporated contingencies for extremes, a fundamental reorientation from reactive to proactive planning. Eleanor Maynard's initial response to this attention was withdrawal. She limited visitors and declined formal recognition from the county commissioners when they attempted to honor her exemplary citizenship in August 1888. However, evidence suggests she did selectively share her knowledge. The Henderson County Historical Society collection includes multiple hand-copied versions of her weather journal and construction notes, distributed to specific families in surrounding communities. This selective sharing reflected her assessment of genuine interest versus temporary enthusiasm. As documented in her personal correspondence, she distinguished between those seeking insurance against fear and those committed to systematic preparation. Her willingness to share detailed information correlated directly with evidence of implementation rather than mere curiosity. Most telling was her interaction with Joseph Dunlap, the sawmill operator who had once mocked her waste of good stone in chimney construction. County records show that in September 1888, Dunlap commissioned Maynard to design heating systems for 3 new buildings in Hendersonville, including the replacement schoolhouse. The payment noted in her ledger was substantial, $87, equivalent to nearly 6 months of average wages. The transition from mockery to professional respect represented a profound validation of her methods. Dunlap's commissions acknowledged not merely the effectiveness of her designs, but their replicability. The underlying principles could be transferred to other structures and contexts. This shift from viewing her success as individual eccentricity to recognizing systematic principles marked a key transition in community perception. This professional recognition represented a significant shift in the community's assessment of Maynard's expertise. The town council minutes from October 1888 include a formal motion to consult with Miss E. Maynard regarding winter preparedness measures for public buildings, with unanimous approval noted. The subsequent report, filed in November, contains detailed recommendations for structural modifications to the courthouse, post office, and general store, all implementing variations of Maynard's design principles. The implementation of these recommendations proceeded gradually over subsequent years. Building permit records show incremental adoption of key features, insulation standards, chimney designs, water storage systems, with more substantial implementation following harsh weather events. The pattern suggests ongoing tension between recognition of necessity and reluctance to allocate resources for contingencies rather than immediate needs. The winter that followed proved mild, as did the next two, but the lessons of 1887 remained fresh. When another severe system struck in 1892, Henderson County reported only 3 weather-related fatalities, all travelers caught between settlements rather than residents in properly prepared homes. McCormick's store maintained adequate supplies throughout, and communal systems for wood and water distribution functioned effectively. The comparative mortality statistics between these 2 severe winters, 23 deaths in 1887, 1888 versus 3 in 1892, provide the most concrete validation of Maynard's approach. While multiple factors contributed to this improvement, county records directly attribute the difference to systematic implementation of preparation methods derived from her practices. The transformative impact of Maynard's influence extended beyond physical preparations. Town records from this period show the establishment of a Community Preparedness Committee that met quarterly to assess collective readiness for severe weather. The committee's structure, outlined in an 1891 charter document, incorporated many of Maynard's methodologies: systematic observation of natural indicators, maintenance of supply inventories, and coordination of resource sharing during emergencies. This institutionalization of preparation represents perhaps the most significant aspect of her legacy, the transformation of individual practice into community protocol. The committee structure formalized the integration of traditional knowledge, animal behavior, plant patterns, with instrumental measurement, barometric readings, temperature tracking, and historical analysis, comparison with previous weather patterns. This systematic approach to environmental risk management represented a significant advance over previous ad hoc preparations. Eleanor Maynard herself maintained a careful distance from these institutional developments. Her preference for isolation remained evident in her limited participation in community affairs. When invited to serve on the Preparedness Committee, she declined, though she did agree to review their observational protocols. Her annotations on these documents, preserved in county archives, reveal her ongoing refinement of predictive methods, particularly regarding the correlation between specific barometric patterns and subsequent temperature extremes. This pattern of selective engagement characterized her relationship with the community throughout the 1890s. While she maintained her solitary lifestyle, she did engage in targeted knowledge transfer through correspondence, consultation on specific projects, and occasional demonstrations of techniques at her property. This approach allowed her to influence community practice while maintaining her preferred isolation. During this period, Maynard's property continued to evolve as a testing ground for her innovations. County tax assessments from 1893 note additions to her original cabin, a greenhouse constructed with a south-facing exposure and double-paned windows, an expanded root cellar incorporating ventilation channels that maintained optimal storage temperatures, and a workshop featuring a forge design that minimized smoke while maximizing heat retention. These improvements represented ongoing refinement of her core principles rather than fundamental changes in approach. Each modification addressed specific inefficiencies identified during the severe winter, optimizing light capture during short winter days, improving storage conditions for extending food viability, and enhancing heat production for metalworking during cold periods. The systematic nature of these improvements reflected her continuous assessment and adaptation process. These innovations attracted professional interest beyond Henderson County. The architectural journal American Builder published an article in April 1894 titled Mountain Adaptations: Innovative Thermal Solutions in Appalachian Construction. While not mentioning Maynard by name, the technical drawings clearly depicted her chimney design and insulation methods. The article noted that these approaches achieved remarkable efficiency in adverse conditions through simple but precise application of physical principles. The recognition of scientific principles underlying her practical methods represents an important transition in the broader assessment of folk techniques. Where her approaches had initially been dismissed as excessive or eccentric, they gradually gained validation through both empirical results and theoretical analysis. This transition from folk wisdom to acknowledged expertise occurred without formal educational credentials, a rare pathway for women of that era. Academic interest in Maynard's methods began to emerge as well. In 1896, Professor James Weatherby of the newly established Department of Meteorology at North Carolina College, later North Carolina State University, visited Henderson County specifically to review Maynard's weather journals. His subsequent paper, published in the American Journal of Meteorology, credited her observational methodology as representing an advanced integration of empirical data and natural indicators, achieving predictive results that merit serious scientific consideration. This academic validation provided institutional legitimacy to knowledge developed through practical experience rather than formal education. Weatherby's paper specifically noted the sophistication of Maynard's barometric analysis, her recognition of rate changes rather than absolute values as predictive indicators, and her correlation of these patterns with specific natural observations. This integration of quantitative and qualitative assessment represented an approach that formal meteorology would not fully adopt for decades. This external validation coincided with increasing local respect for Maynard's expertise. The Hendersonville Times, which had once referred to her as our peculiar mountain hermitess, published an extensive profile in September 1897 with the headline, Henderson County's Weather Oracle, the remarkable predictions of Miss Eleanor Maynard. The article detailed her successful forecasting record and the practical applications of her methods, noting that what once seemed excessive caution has proven to be rational preparation based on systematic observation. The newspaper's editorial shift mirrored broader community perception from dismissive curiosity to genuine respect. The article specifically recounted the initial mockery of her preparations and contrasted this with subsequent validation, explicitly acknowledging the collective failure to heed her warnings before the 1887 winter. This public acknowledgment represented significant recognition of her vindication. As Maynard entered her 60s, her health remained robust, a fact attributed by Dr. Hargrove to her exceptional living conditions and meticulous attention to nutrition and physical activity. His medical notes from an 1899 examination describe her as displaying the constitution and vitality of a woman 20 years younger, with none of the respiratory complaints common to long-term mountain residents. The doctor's observations regarding her physical condition offer additional validation of her living systems, not merely for survival during extreme conditions, but for ongoing health maintenance. His notes specifically reference the air quality in her cabin, attributing the absence of typical mountain respiratory issues to her ventilation design and chimney efficiency. This health dimension added another layer of validation to her comprehensive approach to environmental management. Her professional activities during this period focused increasingly on water management systems, particularly the development of frost-resistant piping for springs and wells. County records from 1900 to 1902 show multiple contracts for consultation on water infrastructure projects throughout Henderson and neighboring counties. The specifications included innovative approaches to preventing freeze damage, such as strategic depth placement, insulation techniques, and gravitational flow designs that minimized stagnation. These water systems represented some of her most technically sophisticated contributions, combining principles of geology, thermodynamics, and material science in practical applications. Her designs specifically addressed the vulnerability of water infrastructure during extended freezing periods, a critical weakness exposed during the 1887 winter. The implementations included redundancy principles and passive protection methods that required no active intervention during extreme conditions. This practical expertise extended to agricultural applications as well. The Henderson County agricultural extension records from this period include multiple references to Maynard method techniques for crop storage and frost protection. Particularly notable was her system for preserving seed potatoes and root crops through winter, a layered sand storage approach that maintained optimal humidity and prevented both freezing and premature sprouting. Farmers who adopted these methods reported significantly reduced losses and improved germination rates for spring planting. The agricultural dimensions of her expertise represented critical contributions to community resilience beyond immediate survival. By improving seed preservation and extending storage viability, her methods addressed the longer-term food security challenges that followed extreme weather events. This focus on agricultural recovery alongside immediate survival reflected her comprehensive understanding of sustainability cycles. In 1903, at approximately age 69, Eleanor Maynard completed what would become her final major project, a comprehensive manuscript titled Systematic Preparation for Mountain Winters, a practical guide to weather prediction, structural adaptation, and resource management. The 2- and 12-page document combined meteorological theory, architectural designs, food preservation techniques, and water management systems into an integrated approach to mountain living. This manuscript, though never commercially published during her lifetime, was reproduced in multiple hand-copied versions that circulated throughout the Blue Ridge region. Its practical impact is evidenced in building permit applications and agricultural practices that incorporated her methodologies well into the 20th century. The Henderson County Historical Society eventually published a limited edition in 1967 with annotations noting which of Maynard's techniques had been validated by modern science. The manuscript represented the culmination of her knowledge transfer efforts, a systematic documentation of principles and practices developed through decades of observation and implementation. Unlike her earlier selective sharing, this comprehensive guide made her integrated approach available to a broader audience. The document specifically addressed the psychological dimensions of preparation alongside technical specifications, acknowledging the cognitive barriers to investing resources in contingencies rather than immediate needs. Eleanor Maynard continued her solitary existence on Widow's Ridge until her death in 1906 at the approximate age of 72. Her burial site, marked by a simple stone in the Hendersonville Cemetery, bears the epitaph she reportedly requested. She observed, she prepared, she endured. The circumstances of her death, documented in Dr. Hargrove's records, align with the self-sufficiency that characterized her life. She had apparently recognized symptoms of heart failure and prepared accordingly, organizing her affairs, completing notation on ongoing projects, and placing her journals and designs in protective storage. She was found seated in her chair near the hearth, a position Dr. Hargrove described as suggesting she faced her end with the same calm preparation with which she approached life. The obituary published in the Hendersonville Times represented a complete transformation in community perception. Henderson County has lost its most far-sighted citizen, whose preparations once seemed excessive until nature proved them precisely necessary. Miss Eleanor Maynard leaves a legacy not of material wealth, but of wisdom that has saved countless lives through improved practices and communal readiness. This posthumous acknowledgment completed the arc from mockery to veneration, a transition that paralleled the community's own evolution from reactive to proactive approaches to environmental risk. The obituary specifically referenced the 23 lives lost in 1887 and the subsequent reduction in weather-related mortality directly attributing this improvement to Maynard's influence on building practices and preparation protocols. The true significance of her legacy emerged during archival research conducted in 1963. Historians discovered that Maynard had maintained correspondence with the Smithsonian Institution beginning in 1882, providing detailed weather observations from the Blue Ridge region. Her data contributed to early national climate studies, though she received no formal scientific recognition during her lifetime. This correspondence, preserved in the Smithsonian Archives, reveals the sophisticated nature of her observational methodology. The letters include detailed discussions of instrumentation accuracy, data verification techniques, and correlation analyses between mountain conditions and broader weather patterns. The exchange demonstrates her engagement with scientific methods, despite her lack of formal training, a self-taught expertise developed through systematic observation and analysis. More remarkably, architectural historians identified elements of Scandinavian design in her cabin construction, techniques that would not become common in American building practices until the 1920s. The source of her knowledge remains speculative, though ship manifests from Baltimore show an E. Maynard arriving from Copenhagen in 1872, suggesting she may have studied Northern European approaches to cold-weather construction firsthand. This international connection provides context for the sophisticated nature of her designs. The double-wall construction with moss insulation closely resembles traditional Norwegian techniques documented in architectural surveys of the period. Her distinctive chimney design, with its widening rather than narrowing stack, incorporates principles found in Swedish Kakelön masonry heaters, known for their exceptional efficiency. Similarly, her water management systems show remarkable parallels to alpine techniques developed in Switzerland and Austria, where freezing temperatures and steep terrain presented challenges similar to those in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The channeling methods she employed for spring water, with their precise gradient calculations and freeze protection features, represent adaptations of European mountain technologies rarely seen in American practice of that era. These international influences raise intriguing questions about Maynard's background and education, questions that historical records only partially answer. The limited personal information available suggests she may have traveled extensively before settling in Henderson County, possibly acquiring technical knowledge through direct observation rather than formal training. What began as local ridicule of an eccentric woman had transformed into a case study in preparation versus presumption. The winter of 1887 and 1888 became known in regional folklore as Maynard's Vindication, a cautionary tale about dismissing unconventional wisdom and the cost of collective complacency. By 1910, the Henderson County Building Code included specific requirements for insulation and heating systems that matched Maynard's original designs. Local schools incorporated her weather journal into science education, teaching students to recognize barometric patterns and natural indicators of approaching weather systems. Her methods of food preservation and storage became standard practice throughout the region. The institutionalization of her principles represents perhaps the most significant dimension of her legacy, the transformation of individual practice into community standard. The building codes specifically reference Maynard standard insulation and Maynard pattern chimneys as required elements for new construction in higher elevations. These standards codified techniques that had once been dismissed as excessive, transforming them into mandatory minimums. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Eleanor Maynard's legacy was the shift in community attitudes toward preparation. What had once been seen as excessive or paranoid became recognized as prudent stewardship. Annual preparation assessments became common practice in mountain communities, with families and neighbors evaluating each other's readiness for winter isolation. This cultural shift represented a fundamental change in risk perception and response, from reactive crisis management to proactive risk mitigation. The community practice of systematic preparation incorporated both technical elements, building design, supply management, and social dimensions, resource sharing, vulnerability assessment. This integrated approach transformed individual vulnerability into collective resilience. The practical impact of this cultural shift became evident during subsequent periods of hardship. During the harsh economic conditions of the Great Depression, oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project indicate that rural communities in Henderson County fared better than many comparable regions. Interviewees frequently referenced Maynard methods of food storage, efficient heating, and resource management as critical to their survival during this period. One particularly telling account came from Martha Jenkins, interviewed in 1937. When the banks failed and money meant nothing, we fell back on what Miss Maynard taught our parents after the big freeze. Our cellar was built her way. Our roof caught water her way. Our walls held heat her way. We ate from storage while others went hungry. It wasn't luck. It was listening to someone who knew what might come. This testimony highlights the transferability of Maynard's approaches. Principles developed for weather extremes proved adaptable to economic crises. The fundamental philosophy of systematic preparation for potential rather than merely probable challenges provided resilience across different types of disruption. The original cabin on Widow's Ridge stood until 1942, when it was dismantled and portions preserved by the Henderson County Historical Society. Architectural drawings completed before its dismantling reveal the sophisticated nature of its design: interlocking corners that minimized heat loss, strategically placed interior walls that created convection currents to distribute warmth, and a chimney system that recaptured and redirected heat rather than allowing it to escape. The documentation of these features provided validation of principles that had initially been dismissed as unnecessary elaboration. Engineering analysis conducted during the dismantling process confirmed the functional basis of each design element. Each apparent excess served specific purposes in environmental management. This technical validation completed the transition from perceived eccentricity to recognized expertise. The technical sophistication of these designs has attracted renewed academic interest in recent decades. A 1994 study by the Department of Architectural Engineering at North Carolina State University concluded that Maynard's double-wall insulation system achieved thermal efficiency ratings comparable to modern construction standards, remarkable for a structure built more than a century earlier without access to contemporary materials. This modern validation highlights the prescience of her approach, achieving through careful observation and materials knowledge what would later require advanced engineering. The study specifically noted her understanding of air movement principles and thermal mass utilization, concepts that would not be systematically incorporated into American building codes until the energy crisis of the 1970s. Similarly, environmental scientists have recognized the prescience of her water management approaches. A 2003 assessment by hydrologists from the University of North Carolina noted that Maynard's spring protection and channeling methods anticipated modern watershed management practices, particularly regarding freeze protection and contamination prevention. The continuing relevance of her methods challenges conventional narratives of technological progress. Rather than representing primitive approaches superseded by modern technology, many of her techniques demonstrate principles of passive system design and resource efficiency that contemporary sustainable design has rediscovered. This perspective repositions her work not as historical curiosity, but as early implementation of enduring principles. What Eleanor Maynard understood, and what her community learned at considerable cost, was that survival in frontier environments depends not on hope or luck, but on systematic preparation informed by observation. The difference between her approach and conventional wisdom of the time wasn't merely one of degree, but of philosophy. Where others prepared for probable conditions, Maynard prepared for possible ones. This philosophical distinction has broader implications beyond practical survival techniques. In essence, Maynard's approach represented a fundamental shift in relationship to environmental uncertainty, from reactive to anticipatory, from hope-based to evidence-based, from communal dependency to individual responsibility, balanced with community resilience. This perspective offers valuable insights for contemporary approaches to risk management across multiple domains. The tendency to prepare for historical averages rather than potential extremes remains a persistent vulnerability in many systems, from infrastructure design to emergency services to food security. Maynard's integration of historical pattern recognition with systematic observation provides a model for more robust preparation approaches. The winter of 1887 stands as a dividing line in Henderson County history, before and after a fundamental lesson in respect for natural forces. While 23 lives were lost, countless more were saved in subsequent generations through the adoption of Maynard's methods. Her legacy wasn't merely a story of individual survival, but a transformation of community practice. In the words attributed to Joseph Dunlap in his later years, Miss Maynard taught us that what looks like excess in fair weather reveals itself as necessary in foul. There's no pride in preparation, only wisdom. This wisdom extended beyond technical knowledge to encompass a moral dimension, the recognition that true self-reliance includes the foresight to prepare for extremes rather than averages. The tendency to prepare for what typically happens rather than what might happen represents not merely a practical miscalculation, but an ethical oversight when lives depend on the outcome. Maynard's approach embodied what modern resilience researchers would call anticipatory adaptation, preparing systems not for historical averages, but for potential extremes based on pattern recognition and trend analysis. This approach has gained renewed relevance in contemporary discussions of climate adaptation and community resilience. The Henderson County Courthouse today contains a small exhibit dedicated to Eleanor Maynard, featuring her weather journal tools and architectural drawings. The display bears a simple title that encapsulates her frontier philosophy: observe, prepare, endure. These three words contain the essence of frontier wisdom, not merely surviving against the elements, but understanding them well enough to live in sustainable balance with their extremes. Eleanor Maynard's story reminds us that true resilience comes not from strength alone, but from the foresight to prepare and the patience to endure. The cyclic nature of weather extremes continues to validate her approach. During the unusually severe winter of 1960, Henderson County again faced prolonged isolation due to heavy snowfall and infrastructure failure. County emergency management records from this period specifically reference Maynard protocols in their response strategy: decentralized resource caches, community heating centers, and systematic checking of isolated residences based on vulnerability assessments. The effectiveness of these protocols during the 1960 crisis provided further validation of Maynard's approach, demonstrating the enduring relevance of principles developed through practical experience rather than theoretical models. The county's after-action report specifically credited these historical practices with preventing casualties despite conditions comparable to the 1887 winter. More recently, during the historic 1993 storm of the century that paralyzed much of the eastern United States, Henderson County's emergency response incorporated principles directly traceable to Maynard's original practices. The county's after-action report specifically cited the value of distributed food storage, redundant heating systems, and community coordination protocols that had evolved from her initial recommendations. This continued relevance across different eras and technologies demonstrates the durability of her core principles: systematic observation, proactive preparation, redundant systems, and distributed resources. These approaches provide resilience regardless of specific technological context, addressing fundamental vulnerabilities in human-environment interactions. In an age of increasing climatic uncertainty, the lessons of Widow's Ridge retain their relevance. The solitary woman who once stood as an object of ridicule now stands as a model of frontier pragmatism, someone who read the warnings in falling acorns and barometric pressure, who respected natural forces enough to prepare for their worst expressions, and who understood that true self-reliance meant preparing beyond what seemed necessary. Contemporary researchers in disaster preparedness have identified key principles in Maynard's approach that align with modern best practices: redundancy in critical systems, diversification of resources, decentralization of storage, and regular testing of emergency protocols. What she developed through observation and necessity has been validated by systematic research more than a century later. The integration of traditional knowledge with systematic observation that characterized her approach offers particularly valuable insights for contemporary environmental management. Rather than dismissing folk indicators as superstition, she incorporated them into a comprehensive system of pattern recognition, validating traditional knowledge through correlation with instrumented measurement. This integration of qualitative and quantitative assessment provides a model for more holistic environmental monitoring. Eleanor Maynard's legacy is not found in monuments or named institutions, but in building practices, community preparations, and a cultural mindset that transformed how mountain communities approached their relationship with an unpredictable environment. Her vindication came not through accolades, but through the quiet testimony of structures that withstood what nature delivered and lives preserved when others were lost. Perhaps the final assessment comes from an editorial in the Hendersonville Times, published on the 20th anniversary of the Great Winter. The true measure of wisdom is not found in what seems reasonable during comfortable times, but in what proves essential during desperate ones. By this measure, no citizen has contributed more to our community's welfare than the woman once mocked for building too well and preparing too much. This recognition of Maynard's contribution extends beyond her specific techniques to the deeper principles they represent: the value of systematic observation, the importance of evidence-based preparation, and the moral responsibility to prepare for what might happen rather than merely what typically does. The frontier spirit embodied in Eleanor Maynard's approach, careful observation, methodical preparation, and quiet endurance, remains the foundation of resilient communities today. Her story stands as testament to the truth that in matters of survival, conventional wisdom often proves conventional folly. The difference between excess and necessity is sometimes only visible in retrospect, after the storm has passed and the accounting of loss begins. In Henderson County, that accounting led to a profound shift in values. What had seemed like individual eccentricity was recognized as community wisdom. The frontier had delivered its harsh lesson, and through one woman's foresight, that lesson was not entirely lost on the survivors. They rebuilt not just structures but philosophies, approaching the mountain environment with newfound respect for its power and unpredictability. Eleanor Maynard's epitaph, "She observed, she prepared, she endured," might well serve as the essential distillation of frontier wisdom, applicable far beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains or the winter of 1887. It speaks to a relationship with the natural world based not on conquest, but on respect, not on hope, but on preparation, not on luck, but on foresight. In this respect, the true story of the solo mountain woman who became a legend is not merely historical account, but continuing instruction, a lesson in preparedness that remains as relevant in today's world as it was on Widow's Ridge in the winter of 1887.